Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending October 12, 2024. Our first story comes to us from Reuters, which reports that the United States State Department has barred former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa and his former Vice President Jorge Glass from entry into the United States due to their involvement in bribery and corruption. The State Department said they have both abused their positions in Ecuador by accepting bribes, including through political contributions in exchange for granting favorable government contracts. The State Department said it also barred the spouses and children of these former Ecuadorian officials from entering the country. Next up, and probably the top story of the week, comes to us from the Wall Street Journal Markets and Finance section. Justin Baird, Dylan Tokar, and Vipal Monga reporting that TD America Bank, or TD Bank, has agreed to pay $3 billion in penalties and growth restrictions for what can only be said was some of the most egregious conduct we've ever seen. It's unclear why banks seem so willing to engage in fraud, money laundering, and other nefarious activities, but TD Bank has to be one of the worst. Literally, from tellers all the way to the executive leadership team of the bank in Canada, one of the world's top banks, TD America Bank, intentionally engaged in willful blindness and put their head in the sand, letting trillions of dollars of transactions go through with no money laundering, starved their money laundering group and their compliance group of any funds, were routinely and often told by internal audit of weaknesses, and had tellers asking, "Isn't this money laundering?" To which bank managers said, "Of course it is." So total fines of $3 billion, interesting growth restrictions as well, and milestones that the bank must meet in their monitorship. Next up, also from the Wall Street Journal, Eric Adams, back in the news as a former aide, is alleged to have destroyed evidence and pushed witnesses to lie to law enforcement officers investigating the alleged political donation fraudulent scheme. The Mohammed Bahi, a senior liaison officer, was charged with witness tampering and destroying records, according to a criminal complaint. So The charges against Mayor Adams and his team just get worse and worse and worse. Next up, from the Houston Chronicle, reports that Gerald Goins, a Houston police officer who fraudulently obtained search warrants, which led directly to the deaths of two people who were not guilty of any crimes, received 60 years in jail for his actions. So what is corruption? Well, in this case, it led to the deaths of two innocent civilians. Next up, from Reuters, the Financial Times, the company Crypto.com received a Wells letter from the SEC, and their response was to sue the SEC, claiming that it was overreach and that the SEC cannot lawfully regulate token sales. Well, if they're an investment, they fall under the Howey test, and if you don't register, you're selling a unregistered investment vehicle. So it's going to be interesting to see. I can't see that this is going to have any success. Nevertheless, given the current Supreme Court, they may say that no, indeed, the SEC can't regulate anything. Next up, from City AM, there was a trial of serious fraud office's employees over the fallout of the ENRC matter, and that trial has been put off while SFO employees are trying to reach a settlement. They are accused of leaking to the press information about ENRC long before any charges were filed. This, of course, relates to the huge scandal that the SFO finds itself in for accepting information from ENRC's lawyer and the attendant fallout from that scandal. Speaking of scandals, from the Chicago Tribune, it reports that the trial of Mike Madigan has finally begun. Madigan was the Speaker of the House in Illinois and is alleged to have been involved in the scandal involving the electric company. Next up, from The Gothamist, and a piece by Stephen Rex Brown writes that Mayor Adams' Turkish bribery allegations may well involve national security. And if national security is involved, that means, of course, the types of hearings we have seen where the information is presented in camera to the court and it's not available to the public. If it involves classified materials, it could endanger national security if disclosed. The U.S. Assistant U.S. Attorney handling the case did not reveal the details of her request for an ex parte hearing, but the filing, which invokes court special procedures regarding classified information, is a sign that the Adams bribery case could involve evidence gathered through surveillance of foreigners or other strategies used in trying terrorism and spy cases. It could be that the government is spying on Turkey or other foreign nationals, and that, of course, is not something that they would typically want to get out. And finally, from the New York Times, it looks like some of the victims from Alan Stanford and Stanford financial scandal of 10 or 12 years ago will finally be paid. The article says that after nearly 15 years, it looks like some of the money may be paid back. The point of the article is, however, many people have taken an early payout, tried to recoup something. So they've made a bet early and it didn't work out, and now they may not get more than they could have had they waited. It's really nothing new and nothing wrong with this, but it just points out the invidiousness of fraud, bribery, and corruption. I hope you have a great weekend. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.